Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba.
Good day and welcome. I'm Joey and this is Orange 20. Today we're going to be talking about building a horror game for your tabletop role playing games. Unlike the other types of games we've talked about, horror is a bit of a different beast. Let me kind of compare this to an ice cream sundae. Horror is the topping on top of the game, and the ice cream is the other type of game that you're running as a horror game. So, for example, with a dungeon crawl, if I was to tell you a story about a bunch of people going down into a dark hole full of monsters in order to retrieve something, I'm sure you can see how I can change the flavor just a little bit to make that into a horror game. In fact, the game I described for the episode on mysteries could easily be run as a horror game, depending on how dangerous you want to make the Changeling Dak. Especially in Dungeons and Dragons, we tend to use action as the sundae topping. We are seeing powerful and competent heroes heading into danger unafraid, more than a match for their foes. Their wounds can be quickly healed by the party cleric. They have the weapons they need to defeat the forces who rallied against them. They have the respect of the villagers who come to them to solve their problems. And it's expected that they're going to be able to destroy the darkness that they come across. But say you want to take goblins that you've put into a mine and instead make this a horror game. You have to think about how horror relies on the unknown, on the frailty of the characters or civilization, and the sense of danger that you have for those things. You want to build on the inevitable dread of the scenario. Before we get much deeper, the first thing I want to touch on is consent. A horror game is a different experience from an adventure or an action game. Unless you are very familiar with your players, I would not recommend tricking them into a horror game. There are players who I've been running games with for nearly 30 years at this point. There are some of these players who, if I invited them to a regular game of Dungeons and Dragons and partway through switched it to a horror game without telling them, they would be ecstatic and would love it. There are others who would be furious at me. These are my friends who don't like ghost stories at a campfire, won't read a Stephen King novel, and watch scary movies through their fingers. While I will invite these players to a horror game, I won't spring one on them. They don't enjoy it as a default, so I want to give them the choice to opt out. Because I've been playing with many of these players for so long, I also know what they're okay with. There's a difference between what disturbs them and what they don't want to experience at all. So I'm going to use myself as an example. I am exceptionally creeped out by horror movie children, adults acting like children in a scary story, and any type of living or possessed doll. I hate those things, but I love watching movies about them, reading books about them, or playing role-playing games about them. I find it cathartic. I'm happy when it's done because I'm actually okay. I am not comfortable with graphic sexualized violence. If the villain or the monster of a story commits their terrible act for a sexual reason, I don't want anything more to be put in front of me than just the implication. I won't stay for a game where those sort of things are described in detail. No, thank you. I will walk away because I will be too uncomfortable with this. When you're playing with people you haven't known for a very long time, like many new game masters might be, it is important to be clear about what you will and won't have in your game. If you're running a horror game, be clear from the outset that this is your intent. I was recently invited to a game which the Dungeon Master described as standard D&D. I was really excited about it, and when I showed up, I had him surprise us by having it be a Dark Souls-inspired slog of hopeless futility. If I had wanted that type of game, that might have been great, but I had a very different vision in mind, and I left the session upset because I didn't get to play the type of game I was expecting. This would have been even worse if it had been full of subject matter that had bothered me. So if you're going to run a horror game, you want to give your players the option to opt out if they don't like the horror aspect you're using. One version of this I've heard of, but I've never tried, is having an object on the table that is the symbol that they opt out. So there's a red stick, and if someone picks up the red stick, it means the game has gotten too intense for them. Everyone agrees to stop immediately, because this is a game, and if anyone is being heavily affected by it in a way they don't like, you want to give them the space they need. You don't need to find out exactly what bothered them right now. They will decide what you need to know and when they're ready to come back, if they're going to be ready to come back. While I haven't tried this method, if I was running a game for people I didn't know well in a horror setting, I would be tempted to use this. But if you're looking for tips on things I've actually done, I recently sent out a message to a group I run games for, asking them if they were okay if I started to introduce horror elements into one of our games, including topics like mutilation, cannibalism, and torture. Notice when you send that message, you don't have to go into any detail. It's a warning, so players who are not comfortable with these ideas can gracefully opt out. Everyone on that message was given the option to contact me directly and let me know if they were uncomfortable with those elements. Sure, I have to give up the surprise factor, but I would rather have my players be comfortable than needing to leave in the middle of a session where I gave them something they weren't ready to deal with. Plus, anticipation is one of your best ways to increase the horror of your game. So those players who got that message are now watching for those things in the game. And by the time this video comes out, I think they're probably still waiting to see them. The wait makes it better.
Yes, you shiver with anticipation.
So once you have consent from your players, there's very few minor tweaks you need to make to the rules of a standard D&D game to increase the horror of it. If you're playing something specifically horror, you probably won't even need to make these tweaks. The first is the aspect of the unknown. A lot of D&D monsters are pretty familiar to experienced players. If you use them exactly as written in the monster manual, some people will know too much about them. However, I want you to remind inspiring dungeon masters out there that the monster manual is actually the default version of these characters. If there were humans in the monster manual, they would be peasants or guards. Player characters exist in the world and they aren't covered by the standard monster manual rules. If I'm taking goblins that have been coming out of the mine to kidnap children, and I want it to be more of a horror story, they just don't need to be the standard D&D goblins. I think they're much scarier if they're fey goblins. So I would start out by giving them a couple of spells. If you care what they look like statistically, maybe give them a few levels of sorcerer, wild magic, or fey warlock. But if I was designing it for myself, I would just say screw it and break the rules. I would look at the spell list and choose a few creepy spells. The first time a goblin casts Misty Step and vanishes into the shadow, it's really going to throw some of your players. Maybe give these goblins resistance to slashing weapons and make sure you describe it as your blade cuts through the thing's warty flesh, it sloughs away with a partial spiral of shadow and reforms, leaving a much smaller wound than you would have expected. The horror is increased by the fact that your players don't know exactly what's happening. While you should know the limits for your monster, feel free to make them almost nothing like the version that's in the monster manual. In a more horror-themed game like Witchcraft, you'll find that the monsters are actually more designed for it. So for the types of monsters in this game, they do have set limits, but there's a variety of strange powers that each monster can have. If you come across a Relentless Dead, you might find that the first one you encounter can regenerate damage so quickly you can't harm it without finding its very specific weakness. Another Relentless Dead may act very similarly, but after it marks a victim, it's able to teleport after them. And I'm not going to tell you how you permanently kill one. And even if I did, this is a monster that is based off of horror icons like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, so you can never be certain that a death you deal to one of these will take. There is another trick you can use to scare your more experienced D&D players, which is to use really high challenge rating monsters. Curse of Strahd did this really well. Most of the adventures in this module pit the players against monsters that are generally way above their level. However, instead of using the standard D&D dungeon design, the players generally only have 1 or 2 encounters at each location. They have one exceptionally deadly matchup, and they have to desperately burn everything they have in order to come out on top. When my most experienced D&D player saw that I was pitting their 4th level party against a Night Hag Calvin, he was more terrified than anyone else. I could see the numbers rolling past his eyes, and he knew how much trouble they were really in. But if you can move to a different game, that's even better. D&D characters are by default very powerful. In most horror stories, the characters aren't. D&D magic is dependable. If I cast a magic missile, it works. If I try to cast a spell in witchcraft, first I have to make a roll to see if I succeed mechanically. And then my game master determines if my intent in casting that spell was dark, because that can also cause things to go sideways. And anytime you use magic, you flare up like a beacon to almost all the monsters around you, who can then come after you, because you look like a tasty treat. Another version of this is something like Warhammer or Call of Cthulhu, where there's an ongoing cost to magic. In Call of Cthulhu, the spells slowly drive you more and more insane, eating up one of your most valuable resources, your sanity points, every time you choose to cast. But a big part of communicating the danger is how you talk in the game. You want to reframe things more like a campfire ghost story. Slow down how you speak. Lower the lights. More than other games, describe the musty smell, the damp, cloying mist that creep across your skin. Use repetitive phrases to signal danger. You hear a huh, 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 deeper in the tunnels, and a pair of pale yellow eyes glare up at you and then blink away. As you head down the tunnel, you hear another huh, huh, huh. You want to use that sound several times before the goblins attack. You want to increase the sense of danger. Characters have few places to turn except for each other. Townfolk, and especially the authorities, are indifferent or outright hostile. If the players have access to divination spells, they are unclear, as though the gods have trouble reaching their clerics through the darkness of the land. When someone gets hit, make sure you don't just say, "You take 8 damage." It becomes, "The dark comes again from its graveyard of a mouth as its dark blade sinks into your flesh. It chills you to your bones. Take 8 points of damage." Even if there's no other effect from this blade, by detailing the damage like that, players worry that there may be an after effect. This wound becomes more important than others they have taken, and the game becomes darker. I would then have the goblin disappear in a puff of shadows, leaving them alone unless they foolishly take a short rest in the mines, waiting for them to move deeper in, increasing the sense of the unknown. One of my favorite horror game techniques is to use what I call a described failure. If you've run a game, I'm sure you've come across a situation where you ask the players to make a perception roll. After they make it and fail, all of the players want to make the perception roll to see if they've seen it, and they want to make investigation checks on everything in the room to figure out what triggered that check. Especially in horror games, I circumvent this while adding to the drama. If they fail the perception check, I tell them, "All right." Balin fails to see the panel in the wall open up. A pale hand reaches out towards him, and as though he senses something is wrong, he turns, but not quick enough to see it dart back into the secret compartment or hear the gentle click of the panel closing. The thing I love is that now the players know. It's cooler when the players know your character failed to hear the soft padding of the warty goblin feet behind them, The crouched beings cackle in the darkness, but you can't pinpoint where it's coming from. Because the players know what happened, their characters are on edge, which is where you want them in a horror game. They don't bog the game down, and then when you launch your ambush, the goblins still get their surprise round because the players failed their check. Sure, they know something's there, but they don't know where and when the attack will come from, and the monsters get the drop on them. So, we went over consent because you like your players and you want them to come prepared to enjoy your game. About how you're changing the rules to make things a bit more unknown, how to increase the sense of danger, and a bit about how to set the mood to reinforce the atmosphere both artistically and mechanically. I feel like this one had a lot in it, and it was a little bit rambly. If you think I missed anything, leave a comment down below. Like or subscribe if you enjoyed these videos. And if you want to see some more horror, check out The Worstly Ever, a video I did with my buddy Renarin, where we took the Telltale Games Walking Dead and played the worst possible version we could morally of the central character Lee. And if you make it all the way through to the last episode, you'll see us breaking down for how terrible and shocked we are by the monstrous things we've done. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Ba 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 ba. Ba 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 ba.
But maybe the rain is really to blame. So I'll remove the cause. But not the symptom.